All right, in this lesson we're going to open SSMS SQL Server Management Studio, create our first database, create our first table, and add some records to it. So if I hit start and just start typing SSMS, it should pop up, and there it is. And again, SSMS is just the front end, connects to any database server, that is, whether that database server exists locally or in the cloud or on a server somewhere. And you see here I've got /. You could type the actual name of my computer might be in here. So you could do that. You could actually even type localhost, not case sensitive. But the reason you saw the / there is that's a nifty little shortcut for connecting to something locally. I would not put that in any connection strings in any code. I would put localhost, but that's a nice little shortcut to know. All right, so there are a lot of folders here and things that we'll get into in subsequent lessons, but for now, let's just expand databases to see a couple there. All right, so I'm going to right click on that top level folder on databases and say new database. Okay, so let me make this bigger, and up here for name I'm just going to do STC for Shih Tzu coding. You wouldn't think it'd be that STC, but it is. Okay, so before you just say okay here, notice the path. So I'm always big on, if you have a C drive and a D drive, that the C drive for operating system and application files, D drive for data. I just have one C drive here. So it might be okay to put it here, but I'd like to have a better handle on where my databases are. So I'm going to choose somewhere else. I would not recommend putting them in your OneDrive folder, wherever that is, because that's constantly syncing with cloud. It seems to be okay for like your Visual Studio Code, but does not seem to be okay for MDF, LDF database files. I've seen some problems with that in the past. Just doesn't seem to be a very good idea. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new folder off the root, which I used to be able to do in here, I thought. All right, well, I guess not. I'm going to open File Explorer real quick. Go to, see, and there's a OneDrive. Like I said, I haven't even set this one up yet. I would not recommend putting a database in a OneDrive folder. All right, so there's the C drive, there's my code folder, and I'll put, I'll call it data. I'll put my database stuff in there. So I'm going to Alt-Tab back over to here. C drive, I need to refresh that. I guess I have to go back and come back in for it to pick that up. C data. All right, if you were doing this for real on a server, you would not put your MDF and your LDF, your data file and your log file in the same folder for separation purposes, but we're just local here, so this is okay. So the logical name is STC. It wants to name the log file STC_log. All that seems fine. The defaults, owner default, let's just hit OK and see where we go here. All right. Disappeared and showed my File Explorer again, so I'm just going to close that to be back here in my SSMS environment. So you see we've got ourselves a database now, STC, and if I click to expand that, you've got tables, views. The most common things with a database, tables, views, and stored procedures. So you would think, well, where are stored procedures? Well, they're actually under programmability, stored procedures. We'll get to that later. So let's expand tables, and so you see all these different system and other things, but I'm just going to right click on tables itself and click new and click table. So we'll do this the graphical way, and later on we can do it the other way. All right, so let's create a table. Let's call this one a dog table. Let's say we just want to keep up with our dogs. I love my Shih Tzus. Well, I have other dogs too, and have had other dogs. So let's say it's a table about dogs. So every table needs an ID. An ID, and I've seen this so wrong in so many places in the past, an ID should be a value that uniquely identifies a record. It does nothing else. Doesn't have any value or meaning about the record itself. It just, all it does is uniquely identify it. In the old days, we used ints more than anything. Modern days, a lot of us use unique identifiers, otherwise known as GUIDs, which you'll see on the Visual Studio side of things. GUID stands for a Global Unique Identifier, which is relates the same. It's a one-to-one relationship with what this is here. And it used to be where these were, well, they are more of a memory hog than like an int, but these days systems can seem to handle that pretty well. And there are advantages for it to being a GUID, a unique identifier, over an int that I might get into at some point in the future. But notice, okay, so allow nulls. Well, you would think, well, if it's a unique identifier, I shouldn't allow that. But before you even have to uncheck that, up here you should see a key, set primary key. And if I click that, it'll automatically make it where I can't make this a null because primary keys are required values. And you see a little tiny key right next to that. So that's saying that this is our primary key unique identifier. And let's do one more thing on it. Down here, if you can see, default value or binding. Let's just do this. I might explain later. New ID, open and close paren. That means if we ever go to insert a record where we don't specify one, which you're never going to because they're long alphanumerics, and you're going to want a system generated one, whether it's from code in Visual Studio or in SQL. So we'll do that so it can do that. And then let's just keep it simple for now. Dog name. And just real quick, pros and cons to prefacing all of your column names with the name of the table. You would think it's the Department of Redundancy department, and it is, but I favor it to not doing it for reasons I won't get into right now. All right, data types for SQL. And these aren't named exactly what they are in Visual Studio. You would think, since Microsoft makes both Visual Studio and SQL Server, they'd exactly match, but they don't. That's just Microsoft. Actually, they bought SQL Server was Sybase a long time ago, a different company. Anyway, so a dog name, we're going to go, so you see the default it wants to put up here as a char. So if it's a char, that means it's always going to be 10 characters. Varchar means it's a variable amount up to 10 characters. N means if you need special characters like umlauts, the little two dots over like German words, or a tilde, things like that, you might want to make it N varchar. Only if you know for sure that there wouldn't be a name that needed special characters, you would go with varchar, but that's like double the space to accommodate that ASCII set. But anyway, and then we don't want to allow nulls, because what's the point in creating a dog record if you don't have a dog name? So let's keep it that simple for now. And I'm going to hit save, and we want to name our table. And this is massively important, and it really is, because your database, your data model, your database design, that's the foundation of your whole project and things you build on top of it. It's your basement, it's your foundation walls, and we'll have a whole separate lesson or 20 on data modeling. But I'm going to call this dog, and I'm going to keep it singular. Some people do plural, but there are pros and cons to just about everything in software, or everything in life. And you might be arguing that this should have been an animal table to begin with, but we'll get into all that later. So anyway, we have ourselves a dog table, and I just saved it, so I don't need this tab anymore. I'm going to close it, and if I come back here to tables, you don't see it, but up here you see a little refresh icon, or F5, and I hit refresh, and now I see it. So there we go, DBO dog, and DBO.dog, and if I right click it, if I right click it, I can choose select top 1,000 rows, and it'll show me the data that is in it, which you see it writes the SQL, of course, structured query language, SQL, some people say SQL, and there are no records down here that have been created. So we can create records either in our query pane here, or we can do it graphically. Let's do the first one graphically, and then we'll do the next two through the query pane, so you can get a handle on that. And if I click on the plus to expand it, you see I can now look and see my columns, keys, whether it's a primary key or a foreign key, which we'll get into later, constraints, triggers, all kinds of other things. But if I right click on dog, you'll see the option here to edit the top couple of hundred rows. So if I click that, graphically now, I can create my data. Now dog ID, it being a GUID or unique identifier, that's a 15 or 25, I can't remember, alphanumeric with hyphens in it, and we set it with that new ID that it would take care of that. So we don't actually have to fill in a value there. And let's of course put in one of my dogs, Lexi, or my Shih Tzu, and I tabbed off it. You see it's gray up there. It's like, well, did it save it? If you want to know for sure, you just want to run the SQL. You see up here, this little arrow here to execute, or Control R. You can hit that and it'll make it where it's not gray, it's now black. And you see that it put in a GUID there. So that is a unique identifier. Globally, most likely, if you ever had a duplicate in the world, you should buy a lottery ticket, I guess. All right, so we have one record in there. So I'm going to close this now. And if I come back here, where there's this SQL here, I can click here to exit, or hit F5, and it'll run that. And down here you now see the dog ID and the dog name. All right. So now let's use the query window here to insert a record. So I'm going to type insert into, oops, did some IntelliSense on me I didn't want. SQL is not case sensitive. And when I hit enters and whatnot, it's just for formatting so things look cleaner. So I'll do insert into dog, and then I could say, well, I guess I could be explicit about it. So I'll say dog ID, dog name, and then values, and it's a single tick in SQL for putting character strings, not a double quote, double tick like in Visual Studio Code. So so it wouldn't be, so if we did one here, we would explicitly, we could say new ID right here if we wanted to, and then dog name Lila, our little spaniel, and close paren. Now if I were just to hit the execute button here, it's going to execute all of this code, which isn't a terrible thing because this is a select statement and then an insert. But if you want to execute just the code you want, you highlight it, and then when you hit execute, it's only going to do what is highlighted. And down here you see one row affected. So then I can come back up here and highlight just the select line, and you can see both records are now in here. Which is also just a kind of a good tip or trick is if you ever are writing updates or deletes, not just, or inserts, updates, or deletes. Really, I should have done it on this here as well. But if you were going to write a delete or something like that, you might put it inside comment lines where if you accidentally didn't have anything highlighted and accidentally hit the F5 key, you would be like, oh my gosh, I just deleted a bunch of records. You would have to come in here and explicitly select to run it. That's just kind of a good practice. All right, so now let's do one more record. And just to show you, I didn't even need to specify. I could have just said dog and the dog name because we did that new ID when we set up the table. We could just do that if we wanted to. Insert into dog, dog name. I'll tab just because I like things to line up. Highlight it, run it. Did I run it? Let me run my SQL. No, I didn't run it. Insert into dog, dog name, values Newman. Run it, one row affected. Come back up here, run my select. And see that I have 3 records. So we started SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. We created our first database. We created our first table. We put a few records into it. We're on our way. Let's go on to the next lesson.